So we're going to talk about tomatoes. I'll just kind of show what I do, and I might ask Eric to chime in a little bit to talk about how they do it, but I don't think they're that much different from what I've seen, except that they do grafting here. And we saw that in the greenhouse. So I don't do grafting. I haven't had a need to. This was our indoor nursery for a while. I used to start all my tomatoes this way. This is more or less the same setup that Eric has in the little in one of the shops there. So at the coldest time of the year when we start tomatoes, we start them that way, just so they start really well and consistent. Anybody in a cold climate is going to do that. Start them in the most warm place possible, and then they get potted up. And we showed that. We showed potting up the other day with the peppers. So then we pot them up, and then they'll stay in a bigger plug for a little while, and then they'll get put out into the field. And so everything I'm doing as far as this step is exactly the same that Eric showed when he talked about potting up. And then the main difference between what we do and what they do is that they graft. So I think the nursery section of that is quite clear. There's not much difference to what I do from Eric, except for the grafting. We've done some kind of specific things over the years with planting, and I know that there's a lot of different ways to do this. So I'm just sharing with what I've done for a number of years and what's worked. We've experimented with interplanting for a long time, and that was basically just so we could keep our greenhouses going with greens in production while the tomatoes are planted. So the tomatoes are growing for a phase while we're still able to harvest greens. That kept the production of our farm up, because when I first started doing tomatoes, as soon as my tomatoes were ready to plant, I'd turn over all of my greenhouses and put tomatoes in. And then I wasn't capitalizing on the fact that those greenhouses were a warmer climate that I could keep doing greens with. So the interplanting allowed us to make a lot more money for a longer period of time with our greenhouses than otherwise. And so that's why we did interplanting. But besides the interplanting, the planting of the tomatoes for us would be more or less the same whether they were interplanted or not. What we do is we would dig a hole fairly deep, like almost a foot deep. We use this little tree planting shovel, a narrow shovel. And then we fill our holes with fertilizer. So that's a Gaia Green 444. It's an organic fertilizer. Put a pinch of that in each hole. And then we put a big handful of compost in each hole. And then we water the hole. So we fill the hole up until the water just soaks through it, so that basically each hole has a lot of moisture in it. And then when our plants are ready to transplant, we prune the top or the bottom two branches, and we plant the plant quite deep. Now, you wouldn't do this with grafting, because with grafting, the graft can't be in the ground. If it is, you're gonna, the top part of the graft is gonna root, and then you're not gonna benefit from that graft that has the beneficial rootstock. So with grafting, you can't plant deep like we do, but we're not grafting, so we do this deep planting where we basically plant the whole thing 2/3 deep. So if the bottom of my plug is there, let's say it's like 18 inches from the bottom of the plug to the top of the foliage, we trim off the two bottom branches and plant the whole thing 2/3 deep. And then what that does is those re-root, and it just makes a really sturdy root that is resilient to the types of high temperature fluctuations we have in our summer. But again, this is it's a regional specific thing. Whether this would work in every climate, I'm not totally sure. So that's just showing more of like how we're doing it, filling up the holes, put the tomatoes in, then we go and close the holes up. So we're planting them 2/3 deep. And so it's kind of funny looking when you first plant, because you had all these plants that were like big and ready to go in the ground, and then when you put them in the ground, they just look like babies again because they've gone so deep. But this has worked for me my entire career. It's kind of hard to see. What Roger's doing there is he's pruning again. So the way we do our tomatoes is a method called hard pruning. So we're aggressively pruning the tomatoes, and that starts about 2 weeks after they get transplanted. So going in from there might only be like 6 to 8 inches out of the ground. The other 10 inches is underneath the ground. 2 weeks later, we start to get some more foliage, we actually go and prune again, and then this is where we start to stake and tie them. So when they first go in, they don't need to be staked or tied. But this is Roger, I mentioned him a few times. He goes in and he'll prune the other 2 bottom branches again so that we have almost a foot of bare stalk and then about 4 or 5 inches of foliage up top. This makes it easy to stake them and tie them when we're starting. So what we do is we go through and we put little bamboo stakes at every tomato, and then we take our strings that hang from our greenhouses, just like in Eric's caterpillar tunnels. If you're curious, when we go back, you can see. We hang twine from those wires, drop them down. We don't tie the string to the tomato, we tie it to the stake. Now, there's another method called lower and lean, which I'll talk about in a minute. I think that's what you guys do, right? Do you lower and lean? We didn't do lower and lean because lower and lean requires a bit more space between your rows. We didn't have that space because we do interplanting. So we didn't lower and lean, but we're more or less doing the same techniques as far as pruning as they are. So once the tomatoes are tied and staked, they pretty much just start growing up the string. And at the beginning of the season, when they're at this phase, we might have to come in twice a week and just give them a little twist. So we don't clip them, we just twist them up the string. And then at this point, we start pruning any of the sucker branches. So the sucker branches are these. So there's your main stem, there's a primary branch, and the sucker is what grows between. Now, Eric does a thing, and maybe I'll get you to talk about it shortly, is they do a double leader on their tomato. So that's letting one of the big suckers go to make 2 leaders. We go single leader, so I'll just finish going through how I do this. So at this point, we just start pruning every single sucker. As we get more into summer, suckers need to be pruned every single day. This is where tomatoes become a lot of work. They are a lot to manage. There's no other crop on our farm that requires this much management. But we get good yields, so they make their money. So we go in and start pruning every sucker, and that happens for a period of time until there starts to become dense foliage and the plants are like 6 feet tall or higher. Now at this point, this is where we start doing our technical hard pruning, where not only do we prune our suckers, we're always pruning the suckers, but what we start to do is prune the other branches below the last ripened fruit. So we start to get these fruit sets in here. You can see some ripened fruit down here, and now what we do is we prune every single branch underneath that ripened fruit and basically have bare stems. So you'll see clusters of fruit amongst bare stem. There's main reasons for that is one, from a practical standpoint, it makes it easier to harvest. It also makes it easier to look and guess what you have. So it's really nice when you go into a greenhouse that has a bunch of hard pruned tomatoes. I could just walk in and look at the row and go, oh yeah, I probably have 20 pounds from there. I probably have 30 pounds from there. So it's over. So from a production standpoint, when you're getting orders and you're thinking about what's in the field, that really makes it easy. And then from the sort of the crop health of it, hard pruning helps airflow, so it reduces disease. It also gets more sunlight on the tomatoes, which helps them ripen faster. So there's a few reasons why you would do it, but for me, the obvious benefit is how much easier it is to harvest without having to navigate through branches. You just pick the fruits; they're all right there. And I like to be able to look at my rows and guess how much I have. It really helps me with communicating with my customers on like a weekly basis. We did interplanting for many years. We would interplant with the greens earlier in the season, like I showed you, and then we would also start planting things like basil amongst the bottom of the rows. And that's another benefit of having the hard pruning, is now there's less foliage there. Light can actually make its way down to the basil, so I can actually grow like a fairly robust basil crop amongst the tomatoes. Even if it gets shade, it can still grow. And we always do tomatoes on drip. That's pretty universal. I think it's completely universal. I don't know anybody that waters tomatoes on overhead unless they're like field tomatoes. like bushing varieties. And so it's important to point out here that everything we do is an indeterminate. Determinate tomatoes are ones that set fruit around a certain period of time. Indeterminates indeterminately set fruits. So they keep growing, you keep managing. One fruit set ripens, it grows up, the next fruit set ripens, and so on and so forth. And you keep picking and picking until you're near the end. These are some of the best varieties I've grown. Sun Golds. Later in my tomato career, I eventually just moved to only growing cherry tomatoes. So I was growing Sun Gold, Sweet Baby Girl, and Sweet Million. Those are like my three sort of commodity ones that I'd grow a lot of. And then I would mix in some of the, what are they called? The heritage ones from Johnny's. So there was like the Pink Bumblebee and Sunrise Bumblebee and Black Cherry. I would mix those in so that I could have, like a mixed basket type thing.
Can you say those again, like the first ones you started with?
Oh, so for cherries was, actually, well, I'll go back to this slide here. There's a lot of my good ones. Sun Gold is like a orange tomato. It's really, really prolific. It's a hybrid. Sweet Million and Sweet Baby Girl. Sweet Million and Sweet Baby Girl are both red cherries, very, very prolific. And then some of the other ones I'd mix in would be Pink Bumblebee, Sunrise Bumblebee, and Purple Bumblebee, I think. That would be like a nice mixed basket. But I would have like 80% would be, say if it was a mixed basket, 80% of my production would be Sun Gold and Sweet Million, say. And then the other 20% would just be a mix of those other ones just to give you a bit of color. But they don't produce nearly as well as the others. So you just kind of grow in a greenhouse that had like 4 or 5 rows. I might just do one row that was a mix for colors, but the rest is like stock stuff. It's the same idea when we talk about lettuce and Salanova. Like 75% of my lettuce is the sweet green crisp. The other 25% is a mix just for color.